Support for WUWM podcasts comes from University School of Milwaukee, fulfilling a values-based mission of developing learners, fostering leaders, and preparing citizens for pre-kindergarten through 12th grade. More information at usm.org/mission.
We have talked a lot here about how President Trump's crackdown on immigration has been playing out in Wisconsin and across the nation. But today we're looking at another country that is playing a big role in Trump's deportation efforts. In El Salvador, President Nayib Bukele has been in power since 2019. He is a controversial figure, to say the least. There have been his aggressive mass incarceration campaigns targeting suspected gang members. The country has also been under emergency orders since 2022, basically suspending constitutional rights. And then there's the issue of the country's infamous super prison, CCOT, which has become a holding cell of sorts for people being deported from the U.S. And during all of this, journalists trying to report on El Salvador have been met with intimidation, surveillance, and other forms of retaliation, some now working in exile in other countries. Jose Luis Sanz covered the region for over 20 years, formerly leading El Faro, the first digital news outlet in Central America. Sanz is originally from Spain and now lives and works as an independent journalist in Washington, D.C. He was in Milwaukee earlier this year for a talk called Detained, Deported, Disappeared: How U.S. Deportees Were Illegally Sent to El Salvador by ICE. He was joined by Adriana Beltran, the executive director of the Seattle International Foundation, which advocates for human rights and freedom of the press in Central America. My colleague Maria Peralta Arellano spoke with them to learn more about how the U.S. relationship with El Salvador has changed under Trump and how immigrants are being affected.
Just to kind of set up this conversation, can you give me a quick timeline of Nayib Bukele and the relationship that has been building between the U.S.?
Well, most of the people knows Bukele because of this idea of the magic solution to the crimes problem or challenge in El Salvador, like this kind of social media savior, is expert that became a political sensation, not only in Central America, but across the hemisphere. But he, before that, was supposed to be leftish politician, originally part of the FMLN, the Frente Farabundo Martí para la Liberación Nacional, the former guerrilla party in El Salvador. He soon became kind of a new political animal and built bridges with the most conservative side of the politics here in the United States, with the Heritage Foundation. And in the first Trump administration, they built this kind of early relationship. Bukele was the president of El Salvador by then, but he was just starting his political project. As Trump arrived to office again, they forged this alliance based on not only migration, but the idea of kind of a new narrative of political control and continuous attack to any kind of political adversary.
Thank you so much for that. And tonight, a program titled Detained, Deported, Disappeared: How U.S. Deportees Were Illegally Sent to El Salvador. So what led to the creation of this, and what made you guys want to bring it to Milwaukee?
Sure. As you mentioned, many people in the U.S. and Milwaukee have been following the stories of the mass detentions that we've seen across many communities, have followed or read in the headlines the cases of Kilmar Abrego, the detention of hundreds of Venezuelans that were then deported without trial, without due process, to this mega prison in El Salvador. But there's a further story beyond the CICOT and the detention that we think it's important to share, as you mentioned, because of this connection between Salvador and the U.S. So we wanted to share more about what's behind the creation of CICOT, what led El Salvador down this path, and what is that relationship between El Salvador and the United States, and the journalists that have been covering and documenting what has happened in a context where they have come under severe attack.
Because that's also a common thing between Donald Trump and Nayib Bukele, and it's that idea that journalists are the enemy of the people and independent media are not independent, but part of some kind of structure trying to oppose to their political project.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that we kind of wove into these commonalities, starting with the attention to the press and treatment of journalists. But how else can we see some commonalities between Bukele and Trump? For me, one of the most apparent ones, especially most recently, was the use of social media. Bukele uses similar propos to amplify the reputation of Sakat, and we see the same thing under the Trump administration.
Well, also this idea that they are new, that they are not politicians, or that they are the former system, the former political or party system. This idea that they are building a new kind of democracy. Obviously, it's maybe a new kind of autocracy, at least in the case of El Salvador. And I think that's also something they have in common, and is how they play with the concept, how they distort words and concepts to build confusion about what they really are, where the limits of the boundaries of democracy or the sense that the check and balances makes or doesn't make anymore in democracy.
So I kind of want to bring very quickly some attention to the actual prison itself. What do you guys know about it? What did you learn just from reporting and working with journalists? What is actually happening inside?
Only a few independent journalists have been inside SECOT. SECOT is the kind of the original name is Centro para el Control del Terrorismo. I mean, the Contención del Terrorismo is kind of an anti-terrorist jail, right? And Bukele always says that it is not only the most secure, but the biggest jail in the hemisphere. The conditions there are extreme, not only because it was built that way, but because it's part of a whole regime of control in political control in El Salvador. El Salvador has been for the last 4 years under a state of exception that suspends legal guarantees and constitutional protection in many ways. So those who are put in jail in the SECOT or other prisons in El Salvador, they lack of any kind of recognition of where they are, access to lawyers, access to their families, or even knowing the charges against them. Many of them are facing now massive trials where 400 people are put into trial at the same time. So the international monitoring system has talked about torture or lack of health care in those prisons. And honestly, many of them, those inmates, are literally disappear inside not only SECOT but the whole Salvadorian system.
But with having Sakat and having this reputation spread out through the entire judicial system in the country, what kind of pressure or feeling does that create for the actual citizens there?
It's a complex question because one of the effects of the state of exception, it was a dramatic change of the presence of gangs on the streets. And for a population, for a country that has been under the threat of gangs, MS-13 and 18th Street Gang, for decades, that has been a real change in their lives. So many people is thankful with Bukele because of that. But at the same time, they know that under the state of exception, they can be detained anytime for any reason, and they will go into a judicial system where you will have no guarantees. I mean, you will be treated as guilty whoever you are, and without any real capacity of proving that you are innocent. So at the same time now the people are fearing the police or the state itself. And this builds a climate of self-censorship that you can taste and that you can perceive as soon as you arrive in El Salvador.
Just to add to that, the state of exception was started in 2022, I believe, and has extended since then. So the exception has become more permanent than an exception to the rule. But also you have, I believe now, around 91,000 people that have been detained, including, I believe, around 3,000 children. So that's about nearly 2% of the population of El Salvador that is in detention.
Also, some legal reforms that the Bukele regime did allows the judicial system to have someone in jail in preventive detention for until 7 years. So without trial, without access to a proper process to study your case. So again, it's kind of a dark hole where you go into the system and you don't know when or why you will be released.
In your experience and through your eyes, where did the deal come from between Trump and Bukele to start sending deportees over to the prison? How did that develop, and what does it look like now even?
Well, I think it's part of the strategy of Bukele to portray himself as a global player, as a global reference, and as a global leader. So he has been trying to build this relationship with Donald Trump, with other players or political actors like Elon Musk, etc., for a while. And I think he finally found a way to do so. I mean, to be useful for the Trump administration, for the Trump political project. And building this idea of not only a safe country, but the toughest one, the one who is able to control any kind of criminal and keep in jail behind bars any kind of global criminal is part of the narrative of a safe country, and I think it works well with at least for Trump, with the idea that he's taking away from the United States criminals, whoever they want, even if they are not. I think people in El Salvador is not really happy with this idea of being the prison for kind of a private prison for the United States. But the idea of a global leader who has deals, negotiates with the United States is something that Bukele has been looking for a while.
For a journalist and someone who supports journalists, what does support look like for people who are working under such conditions or trying to cover things that are happening under authoritarian leaders? What's needed and what changes as things kind of escalate?
Well, support comes in the form of economic support, of course, financial support, but also in terms of public support. One of the things is that most of Salvadorian journalism is now working in exile from Mexico, from Guatemala, from Spain. In some cases, not many of them from the United States, because the United States is not anymore perceived as a safe country for independent journalists or even social leaders coming from Central America and facing threats in Central America. But obviously we need help to raise the voice and to reach more people, more ears and more spaces where to debate this and to build some kind of conscience and political reaction.
And just to add, in the case of El Salvador, it has been journalists and independent media that have brought and covered these issues of what is happening on the ground and have revealed a lot of, what is behind Bukele's strategy at a grave cost, as you mentioned. They've been surveilled. They've had, legal attacks. Bukele has used institutions to go after them administratively, and Jose Luis can speak more, to the surveillance that they've been victims of. But last year alone, you had over 40 Salvadoran journalists forced into exile. And this, unfortunately and worryingly, is a pattern that we see in other countries that have followed that same playbook of viewing journalism as the enemy of the people, something that we hear also from Washington. In places where you have closing spaces of participation where institutions are not working, it is journalists that are holding the power to account. Support means, economic support, that foundations like ours provide, but also other kinds of support, from accompaniment to providing them with other resources, security. We also provide spaces for psychosocial support, because it's also that human aspect, right, of being forced to leave your home, to leave your family, to go work somewhere. What does it mean to work from exile? When you're not talking about a few days, but it can be long-term exile.
And that was kind of my next question. What was the personal cost for you? We had mentioned surveillance, but just what was that experience like?
My case is a little different from the one for most of my colleagues, because I am originally from Spain, so I have an European passport, and that honestly makes a difference sometimes in terms of legal protection or political protection. And also, I don't have family in El Salvador. But for many of my colleagues, exile means letting the families behind or finding the way of reunite with them abroad, whether it is in Mexico, Guatemala, Costa Rica. Is also, in some cases, losing contact with their parents, and it's also hard to feel that you are paying the consequences of doing your job.
That was journalist Jose Luis Sanz and Seattle International Foundation's Adriana Beltran. They spoke with my colleague, Maria Peralta Ariano. In July, it was announced that Bukele would run for a third consecutive term in the country's February 2027 elections. I'm Jimmy Gutierrez. Status Pending is produced by WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, part of the NPR network. Music in today's episode is from Blue Dot Sessions. Thank you so much for listening, and subscribe to Status Pending for more stories about immigration in Wisconsin and beyond.
The fatal shooting of a teenager at a protest in Seattle has gone unsolved for 6 years.
This is open in your face. How are there no answers?
Our investigation has uncovered new evidence and witnesses who say they've never talked to police.
Did police ever call you? Not once.
Listen to We Keep Us Safe, a new true crime series on the Embedded podcast from NPR.